A national constitution is typically expected to be a brief, high-level framework. The United States Constitution, for instance, sets up its entire republic in just 7 articles. Compare that baseline to the original Constitution of India. While the U.S. relies on 7 articles and Canada operates on 147, the Indian drafters codified 395 distinct articles. The scope extends far beyond basic rights and government branches. It catalogs citizenship, state policies, the union judiciary, and the specific legislative powers of individual governors across a dense array of parts. It drills down into granular administrative specifics, explicitly dictating the official languages of the Supreme Court, the functioning of administrative tribunals, and highly localized temporary provisions for specific states. No other nation has engineered a foundational document of this physical scale. The document functions as a comprehensive administrative manual, prioritizing exhaustive operational detail over high-level philosophical rhetoric. The drafters rejected traditional minimalist design. The document size indicates a specific function beyond basic bureaucracy, operating as a rigid framework to stabilize a massive, newly independent state. At its inception, critics within the Constituent Assembly attacked the document's design. The primary accusation was a distinct lack of originality. Assembly members described it as an unwieldy patchwork of borrowed concepts, predicting the massive text would result in an unmanageable bureaucratic maze. The dense, complicated phraseology led members like H.K. Maheshwari to label it a lawyer's paradise. The argument was that the extreme legal complexity would alienate the common citizen. In this view, the legal precision acts as a gatekeeper. The Constitution functions as an intricate clockwork system, demanding specialized legal expertise to navigate it. However, this extraordinary volume is a deliberate engineering choice. It was designed to enforce order over a volatile, massive post-colonial state, where implied rules would be entirely insufficient. Understanding the Indian state requires reading its constitution as a rigid administrative manual, specifically engineered for the survival of the democratic system. A constitution is the structural rulebook of a state. It organizes the government and establishes the relationship between the governing bodies and the people. Political science separates that physical rulebook from the concept of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism requires that a government operates under a system of effective restraints, explicitly restricting authority through law. A state can possess a formal constitution without practicing constitutionalism. A dictatorship, for example, has a rulebook, but it lacks the mechanisms to limit its own arbitrary power. The architects of the Indian Republic recognized that in a fragile environment, relying on broad, vague principles was dangerous. Abstract ideals do not restrict a motivated executive branch. To enforce actual constitutionalism and eliminate the possibility of arbitrary rule, they chose to leave nothing to assumption. Securing those boundaries required writing an impossibly dense, explicit manual. 4 specific historical and geopolitical pressures forced this document to expand far beyond a standard legal framework. First is the geographic and demographic scale of the subcontinent. Governing extreme heterogeneity required specialized, detailed rules for different regions, scheduled castes, and tribal areas. Second is the institutional legacy. The drafters relied heavily on the Government of India Act of 1935, importing its massive, pre-existing administrative blueprint directly into the new text. Third, unlike the United States, India combined the governance structures of both the central union and the individual states into one unified document. Finally, the Constituent Assembly was dominated by legal luminaries. Their professional training demanded that every provision be exhaustive and legally watertight to prevent future loopholes. The physical size of the text is the direct result of a mandate to govern intense regional diversity and complex state mechanics within a single, unbreakable legal container. This reliance on existing frameworks led to the fierce criticism that the drafters lacked originality, effectively ransacking the legal structures of the known world. The structural borrowing is documented in Table 4.4. Parliamentary government was pulled from Britain. Fundamental rights were extracted from the U.S., and directive principles from Ireland. This was a calculated strategy. The drafters imported systems that had already survived real-world stress tests. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar explicitly defended this method. He stated that there is no blind patent right in the fundamental ideas of a constitution. The Assembly acted as structural engineers. They sourced the most reliable components globally to build a highly specific, bespoke machine, calibrated exclusively for Indian realities. Building that machine required managing opposing political forces. A primary conflict lies in the amendment process, balancing a rigid constitution that protects core rights against a flexible one that can adapt to new economic realities. The solution was a hybrid model. Certain foundational provisions require a special majority and state ratification to change, while the Parliament can amend other, more administrative sections using ordinary legislative procedures. A deeper tension exists in the geopolitical structure itself. The document outlines a federal system, dividing power between the national government and the states. Yet it builds in a massive unitary bias that deliberately centralizes authority. This dual-mode architecture allows the nation to function as a cooperative federation under normal conditions. However, during a declared national emergency, the constitutional machinery converts the system into a powerful unitary state. This specific engineering guarantees that regional autonomy can operate day to day, but the central state retains the absolute sovereignty required to prevent the fracture of the republic. Another major balancing act was reconciling two incompatible legal doctrines: the British principle of parliamentary sovereignty and the American model of judicial supremacy. Adopting either extreme presented a threat. Absolute parliamentary control risked a legislative dictatorship, while unchecked judicial supremacy could gridlock the developmental agenda of the state. The framers manufactured an equilibrium. The Supreme Court can strike down unconstitutional laws, while the Parliament retains the constituent power to amend the Constitution itself. They used precise legal phrasing to enforce this limit, opting for the narrow language of procedure established by law over the broader American concept of due process to restrict judicial overreach. Defining the exact boundaries of these competing powers left zero margin for error. Codifying that balance required thousands of words, actively driving the expansion of the document. When you map the entire text, the sheer volume reveals an interdependent system. Part 3 guarantees fundamental rights, Part 4 directs the economic policy of the state, and Part 18 provides the emergency brakes. The text goes further by embedding entirely independent administrative bodies, like the Election Commission and the Public Service Commissions, directly into the constitutional framework. These distinct legal mechanics assemble together into a single, interlocked structure that defines the state's entire operational capacity. Leaving the mechanics of elections or civil service to ordinary legislation would have invited immediate political tampering. Encoding them at the foundational level guaranteed their survival against shifting majorities. This strict codification fueled the critique that the Constitution is essentially un-Gandhian. Critics argued it abandoned Mahatma Gandhi's vision of a decentralized, village-led democracy in favor of rigid, centralized legalism. But the drafting committee distrusted localized power structures, which had historically entrenched caste hierarchies and social inequality. They believed a powerful, centralized legal apparatus was the only effective tool to enforce civil rights across the subcontinent. The exhaustive detail was a defensive measure. In a massive, nascent democracy, exact precision eliminates the gray areas where authoritarian interpretations take root. The Indian Constitution is intentionally enormous because it carries the administrative weight of a subcontinent. It is a prescriptive manual designed to manufacture consensus and stability out of extreme diversity. The scale that critics mocked is what gives the document its strength. That weight has kept the Indian democratic experiment securely anchored through decades of immense pressure.